Hello, welcome to my video tutorial on the Brainstem. My name's Ben, and today I'll hopefully be guiding you through some of the content of the Brainstem. By the end of today's session, hopefully you'll be able to describe the three components of the Brainstem. We're also going to talk about the key structures on the Brainstem, including looking at some cross sections of the Brainstem, and hopefully you'll be able to describe some of the key functions of the Brainstem as well. Throughout this session, to try and make it a bit more personal, I've got this whiteboard here next to me, this trusty whiteboard, and throughout the session I'll be pinning some stuff against it and talking through it, and alternate between doing that and some screen recordings to try and keep it a bit more interesting. I've also got some activities planned through the session, and I've got a quiz at the end and a feedback form, which I'd obviously really appreciate if you can spare the time to fill it out. Now, I've highlighted here some of the links to your wider program for this session. So this session is aligning to your module objectives 1 and 2, your program level learning outcome K1, and this aspect of the Sheffield graduate attributes. And all of this is by increasing your specific knowledge in anatomy and in biomedical science. The session is also going to have us looking at some applications of knowledge. And another thing to note in this session is that by completing it, you're becoming reflective, self-aware, you're taking ownership of your own learning, and you're becoming adaptable, resilient, and flexible in your approach, because you've transitioned to this system of online teaching. Let's just have a look at the brain as it's cut in mid-sagittal section so we can appreciate some of the structures surrounding the brainstem. So we've got the brainstem here outlined between these two lines, but we've also got some important structures around it. So we've got the cerebrum, or the big bit of our brain. We've got the thalamus, which is sitting just above the brainstem, and then we've got the cerebellum, which is sitting behind the brainstem. And then finally, we've got the spinal cord, which is coming from below the brainstem and is going to be continuous with it. So the brainstem is going to act as a link between all of these key structures. So it's going to bring ascending tracts up from the spinal cord, and it'll bring descending ones down, and it'll also communicate with the cerebellum, as we'll see later. So let's just take a closer look now at the divisions of the brainstem. So the brainstem split up into 3 parts. We've got the midbrain, which is sitting at the top of the brainstem, the pons, which is this bulgy bit in the middle of the brainstem, and then we've got the medulla oblongata inferiorly on the brainstem. The medulla was previously called the bulb, so just be wary of that as you're reading textbooks or watching YouTube videos, because different places will call it different things, but it all means the same thing. Then if we have a look, we've got a ventral view on this side, or an anterior view on the left, and then we've got a dorsal view on the right. And again, we can just see that the brainstem is going to be split up into the midbrain, the pons, the bulgy bit, and then the medulla. And then finally at the top we've got the thalamus, which makes up most of the diencephalon. So that's attached to the brainstem at the very top. So we'll take a quick look now at the ventricular system, which is surrounding the brainstem. So up at the top here, in between the 2 bits of the thalamus, we've got the 3rd ventricle. That's then going to continue down inferiorly as the cerebral aqueduct, which is running in the middle of the midbrain here. And then the cerebral aqueduct is going to continue inferiorly and become the 4th ventricle. So we can see the 4th ventricle is this triangular shape in this mid-sagittal section, and it's in between the pons and the cerebellum. We'll take a look now at this image to illustrate the functions that the brainstem has. So this is comparing a human brain versus all of these brains of all these different animals. So we can see in a human brain, we've got this big bit represented in yellow, the cerebral cortex. So the cerebral cortex is obviously what does all of our sort of cognitive abilities, things like memory, and things that we need like processing. So the things that really make us human. And it's much more developed to allow us to do these things. But if we have a look at this purple section, the brainstem, we can see that it actually looks really similar compared to all of these different animals. So the brainstem is going to carry out all these basic functions which all of these animals need in order to survive. If we have a look at these two images now, we can see the centers for cardiovascular control, so the centers that are going to stimulate our heart and cause it to beat. We can see these are originating from the medulla. And if we have a look on this image, we can see the centers that are controlling our respiration, the centers that are stimulating our reflex to breathe, are coming from the pons and the medulla. Don't worry about trying to memorize the location of these specific centers. This is just to illustrate the point that the centers of which control our heart rate and which control our breathing rate are coming from within the pons and the medulla. So if you remember, the skull is this sort of like really fixed cavity. So when we get an increase in pressure, such as what we've got here, it really leaves us little room to maneuver. So what can happen is the cerebellar tonsils can get pushed down through the foramen magnum and can then compress the brainstem. And this will essentially shut down someone's cardiovascular and respiratory centers, and they'll lose the desire to breathe and they'll die. So, quick recap then on what we've covered so far. So we've talked about the divisions of the brainstem, the midbrain, the pons, the medulla, and we've talked about some of these important surrounding structures. We've also talked about some of the key functions of the brainstem. First of all is to link these key structures together, such as the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the spinal cord. And we've also talked how the brainstem is really important because it contains these centres for cardiovascular and respiratory control. So these centres which are just essential for life, no matter if you're a human or if you're a frog or you're a dog or a cat or whatever. So this is a really good time in the tutorial. Just take a few minutes, stand yourself up, have a quick stretch, maybe do a few star jumps or some press ups or whatever you fancy, and maybe think about getting a cup of tea, and then come back to it in a few minutes and you'll be much more focused. So I've just planned a couple of activities now because you're going to learn so much more from trying something yourself first, rather than me just telling you everything about it. So what I want you to do is just pause the video now, try and label each of these structures, and then try and put down something you know about each structure, or say where it links to in the brain. So just take a second now to check your answers, and then I'm going to talk through each of these structures in turn. So we'll start off at the top of the image then. So first of all, we've got these two bits, which are the cerebral peduncles. These are going to connect the cerebrum to the midbrain. We've also got, in the centre of these cerebral peduncles, in this space, the interpeduncular fossa, the mammillary bodies. So these aren't part of the brainstem, they're actually part of the limbic system. But I've put them on here because they're a really useful anatomical landmark to tell where we are. So I've got a nice picture here to show the function of the cerebral peduncle. And we can see, if we look at this diagram, that the cerebral peduncle is carrying this pyramidal tract. It's continuous with it. If we look over here, we can see in this cross section of the midbrain, here at the front, where we've cut into the cerebral peduncle, we've got these fibres of the pyramidal tract along here. So the cerebral peduncles are carrying the pyramidal tracts. So we'll pick up where we left off. We've got the pons in the middle here, and each side of that is connected via the middle cerebellar peduncle to the cerebellum. Then if we look further down into the medulla, we've got two swellings on the front, which we call the medullary pyramids. And then lateral to each of these pyramids, we've got a little swelling called an olive, which just looks like an olive. Inside of the olive, we've got a structure called the inferior olivary nucleus. and we'll have a look at that when we look at the cross sections and talk about it in a bit more detail. Finally, most inferiorly, we've got the point of which the decussation of the pyramids occurs. So if we have a look at the overall structure of the pyramidal tracts, they'll start off in the motor cortex, come down from the internal capsule, come through the cerebral peduncles, down through the pyramids on the medulla, and then 85% of the corticospinal tracts will cross over at this decussation and carry on down the spinal cord. So exactly the same again now. This time we're just on the dorsal surface of the brainstem. So just take a second, pause the video, try and label all these structures, and then try and say something about each structure, or say whereabouts in the brain it links to. So just take a second now again, just check your answers, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these structures. So starting at the top again, and we'll work our way down. So at the top we've got a thalamus on either side, and in the centre we've got a pineal gland. So pineal gland is really useful for identifying where we are, and it's a really good anatomical landmark. But I'm not going to talk about either the thalamus or the pineal gland because it's outside the realm of this tutorial. So go and give them a Google if you're not sure what they do. So just below the pineal gland then, we've got the superior colliculi and we've got the inferior colliculi. So these have a few different names. They're sometimes called the tectum, which means the roof or the roof of the midbrain, and we'll have a look at that in a sec. And they're also sometimes called the corpora quadrigemini. So corpora or corpus means body, quad means four, and then Gemini means twins. So these are the four twinned bodies. Now these are really important in reflexes, which are going to get you to turn your head. So the superior colliculi are connected to the lateral geniculate nucleus, which if you remember is to do with vision, and then the inferior colliculi are to do with the medial geniculate nuclei, which is to do with hearing. So when you see a flash off in the distance, or if you hear a loud bang, you'll turn your head to it and see what's going on. So that's your colliculi enacting that reflex so that you can see if there's a prey or a predator that you might need to try and eat or run away from to try and stay alive. So carrying on further down then, we've got the group of three cerebellar peduncles, which I'm going to talk about in more detail in a second. And we've got the gracile tubercles and the cuneate tubercles, which are located on the medulla. So these points, these little bumps, contain nuclei for the dorsal column pathway. So the cuneate tubercles are going to receive fine touch and proprioception from the hands, and the gracile tubercles are going to receive fine touch proprioception from the feet. So I always remember that the cuneate, I always think of like cunicles on your fingertips, and gracile as being like a dancer has got to be gracile on her feet. So we've got the cuneate tubercle collects information from the hands, and then the gracile tubercle will collect information from the feet. So we can see here now on this diagram, we've got a better view at the cerebellar peduncles. So first of all, we've got the middle cerebellar peduncle. We can see again that that's coming off the pons going towards the cerebellum. And then on this side, on the right side, we can see the superior cerebellar peduncle coming off the midbrain here, and the inferior cerebellar peduncle coming from the medulla down here. Then, just to say a quick note about the cerebral peduncles versus the cerebellar peduncles. The cerebral peduncles connect the midbrain to the cerebrum, as we've said before, but the cerebellar peduncles are connecting to the cerebellum. But just make sure you don't get them mixed up because they sound quite similar. So what's the tegmentum and what's the tectum? So this is one that often really confuses people. So I'm just going to go through it now. So the tectum means roof in Latin. So if you have a look at a cross section, a mid-sagittal section, then we can see that the brainstem has this sort of slant to it, and that this part is the roof, which is highlighted with this number in 15. So again, like we said before, this tectum then encompasses the superior and inferior colliculi. And then we can also split this using the cerebral aqueduct. So we can say that posterior to the cerebral aqueduct is the tectum, and anterior to it is the tegmentum. So you can see these highlighted here. So we've got the tectum is the roof of the midbrain, which is found posterior to the cerebral aqueduct, and we've got the tegmentum is the bit that's anterior to the cerebral aqueduct. So we've just gone over quite a bit of information there. So I want you to pause the video now, write down one thing that you've learned, and write down one thing that you're still not sure on. Doing this activity should help you figure out what you need to go and have another look at. So onto some cross sections now. So same principle as before, just have a go at labelling it before you have a look at the answers, and just remember that the nuclei or the cell bodies show up as light on this cross sections, and that the tracks or the nerve axons are dark. So we'll go through the answers now then. So here we've got the cross section that we're looking at. Here's the back of the cross section with the fourth ventricle, and here is the front of the cross section with the pyramids. Remember that we said that the tracks will stain dark, so this is why we can see the pyramids have stained dark, because of all the corticospinal tracts and the corticobulbar tracts. And we can see structures such as this, the inferior olivary nucleus, have stained light, because this has got lots of cell bodies. So this, the inferior olivary nucleus, is then going to connect to the cerebellum, and it's actually going to connect via the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So if you remember that we said that's what connects the medulla to the cerebellum, and then the inferior olivary nucleus is going to have an important role in sort of motor adaptation, such as learning to ride or riding a bike. Then finally, just in the middle here, towards the midline, we've got these two tracks of the medial lemniscus pathway. So this is the pathway which carries fine touch and proprioception. Same again here. Have a go yourself first, and then we'll go through the answers. So let's have a look at the answers for the pons now. So same as it was in the last diagram, this is the dorsal side, and this is the ventral side. So you can tell this is a dorsal side because it's got the fourth ventricle at the back. As we see, the fourth ventricle is behind the brainstem, but also then the fourth ventricle is between the brainstem and the cerebellum. Then on this, we can also see this structure, the middle cerebellar peduncle, which we saw connects the pons to the cerebellum. So the midbrain, we're going to flip it on its head a little bit from what we've been doing in the medulla and the pons, and I'm going to talk about it for a little bit, and then there's a test yourself activity in the quiz that you can complete. So with the midbrain, the first thing to say is this is how it sits in the brain. So you can see here the cerebral peduncles at the front, and back here are the colliculi, so we can see that on here as well. When we cut through a cerebral peduncle, it becomes the crus cerebri. So those two terms are often used interchangeably, the crus cerebri and the cerebral peduncles. But the crus cerebri, crus meaning sort of cross, essentially just means a cross section of the cerebral peduncle. Then another important structures for us to look at is the substantia nigra. So this is really important in patients with Parkinson's disease. So if you're interested, go and have a read about that. Then we've got the red nucleus, which is this red-looking nucleus inside the midbrain. This is important because it links to the rubrospinal tract, which we're not really too sure what it does, but we sort of think that it's to do with fine motor movements. And then finally, the last thing that we'll look at is here we've got the cerebral aqueduct, which will then divide between the tectum, which is posterior, and the tegmentum, which is anterior to it. So that brings us to the end of my video tutorial on the brainstem. I hope you guys have found it useful. Hopefully you should now be able to meet these learning outcomes. So in this session, we've described the three components of the brainstem and talked about some anatomical relations. We've looked at some of the key structures of the brainstem, including in cross sections, and we've talked about some of the functions of the brainstem. Any questions at all whatsoever, don't be afraid to drop me an email. I've included a quiz to help you summarise your knowledge at the end of this session, and I've also included a feedback form. Obviously the feedback form's optional, but I would really, really appreciate any feedback you guys could give. It'll only take a couple of minutes to complete. All right, thank you.